Mhm.
All right, here we go. How's that? Is that back to normal? Everyone's okay, great. Sorry, apologies. Okay, just some quick announcements. HMSC Science on Tap on Wednesday, December 15th at 6 p.m. Selena Happel, professor and department head with Oregon State University's Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences, will be at the Hatfield Marine Science Center presenting a public virtual talk entitled Marine Reserves Essential for Conservation or a Threat to Fisheries. Okay, next week seminar, December 16th, will be fully remote where with Andy Stevens from the Northwest Fisheries Science Center and NOAA. Located at the Hatfield Marine Science Center, she will talk, I'm sorry, I'm reading this wrong. Located at the Hatfield Marine Science Center, she will talk to us about the use of a study of radioactive fish ears, or how I learned to stop worrying and love the bomb. I did read that correctly. Reminder that the Hatfield Student Organization's silent auction ends at 5 p.m. tomorrow. Don't miss out on the return of the HSO Cookie of the Month. Check out handmade mugs, socks, wood burn crafts, graphic designs, and more from talented artists here at HMSC. Fund support HSO Travel Awards and Hatfield Student Organization Research Awards for the next year. There's a live auction, www.32auctions.com, HSO 2021. And also check out their HSO swag, shirts, mugs, tote bags, and hooded sweatshirts for even more great holiday gifts that support HSO. You can email hso@oregonstate.edu if you'd like to get a, I'd like to order those. All right, so for today, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Dr. Meagan Wengrove is an assistant professor of coastal engineering in School of Civil and Construction Engineering at the College of Engineering at Oregon State University. She completed her PhD in ocean engineering in 2018 at the University of New Hampshire. And Dr. Wengrove's teaching interests include hydraulics, coastal engineering, sediment transport, turbulence and boundary layers, and engineering nature-based features. Before coming to OSU in 2018, she spent almost 2 years doing research projects in the Netherlands and has done consulting focused in coastal wave mechanics and hydraulic dam removal. Meagan's scientific interests are related to the morphodynamic evolution and the interaction of scales in natural and nature-based systems, with recent projects focused on beach and dune nearshore sediment transport and the evolution of the ice-ocean interface at tidewater glaciers. Meagan is also a new addition to the team at HMSC and will have office and lab space on the 3rd floor of the Gladys Valley Marine Studies building starting in the new year. So Meagan, thank you for being here with us. You have our attention.
Thanks, Achan. Oh. Maybe it stopped sharing. I think if you push that again, then this. Try to share.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Great. You still see it okay? Okay. All right, yeah, thanks for having me. Am I supposed to wear a mask while I'm presenting? No, okay. Yeah, so the title of this talk is Beach Dune Subsurface Hydrodynamics and the Formation of Dune Scarps. And it was really a big collaborative project we did at Oregon at the Corvallis campus, where we have the Hinsdale Wave Research lab facility. If you guys haven't been there to visit, let me know, and I'd be happy to give a tour for people who are interested. Oh yeah.
disappear at all. Online it's disappeared? Okay. Sorry, guys.
I think I can. Yeah, okay, well, I don't think it's going to affect too much of the slides. So anyway, we did this project with OSU, Texas A&M, University of Delaware, and then some different international universities. Everyone came to Corvallis to work in this lab facility. And the project was supported by NSF. Okay. So the motivation behind the story I'm going to tell you is basically based upon the state of the US coastline. So 67% of the US coastline is protected by natural habitat, which if lost would double the number of poor families, elderly people, and total property value in the areas of highest risk from coastal hazards such as storm surges. So anywhere you see red on this map of the US, we're in really high vulnerability to storm surge and storm surge erosion. And so there's a line of research focused on how can we use natural infrastructure, which are dunes, marshes, mangroves, those types of features for coastal protection. So they have dual benefits of providing habitat as well as protection to communities that live there. So this particular project was focused on dune erosion, and we tested 3 different dune archetypes: a bare dune, which had no vegetation, a vegetated dune where we grew the vegetation in place, and then a bio-cemented dune, which would be like more of an engineered dune where you inject the sediment with this bacteria that naturally cements it together, making it kind of like sandstone, increasing its erosion resistance. And then the cool part about it is that when it breaks apart, it kind of rolls around in the surf and eventually goes back to sand. So you're not like putting concrete on the beach. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but if you have questions, I'm happy to answer that or answer those. This talk is mostly focused on why beaches and dunes scarp, like the physics behind their scarping, and then a little bit about the difference between scarping of a bare dune and a vegetated dune. So we used the large wave flume, which is a facility at the Corvallis campus. It's 104 meters long, 4 meters high, and 3 meters wide. It's the biggest flume in the US, and we have a lot of different projects going in and out of there from all over the US, researchers from all over the place. We built a 1 to 2.5 scale dune in the flume. And so you can see the dune here, and we actually trucked like 56 dump trucks full of sand from the South Jetty. The Army Corps didn't want the sand on the jetty. And so we were able to leverage that, be like, okay, well, if you give us our sand, give us your sand, we'll take it away. And so it worked out that way. That was a big logistics, logistics fun problem. And then to grow the plants, which I'll talk about a little bit later, we actually built a greenhouse over the dune and we grew them in place for 6 months. Okay. So dune erosion, these are different pictures of dune erosion around the US. We can see a scarp that's formed in Lincoln City, one in North Carolina and Surf City, and Florida, and in New York. And basically the common theme behind these photos in particular is that behind these scarps are communities or roadways or things that we as people care about to get around our homes. We also care about dunes and natural habitats in a different way, but yeah, so there's a balance between those 2 types of features. So what is a scarp? a scarp is that steep step that you might see on the beach. They happen all over Oregon. I've seen them several times. And one day it won't be there and the next day it might have formed. And when a scarp forms, it is a very erosive feature because once it forms, then when surge and waves come up and hit the scarp, then notching can occur. So it notches underneath the face of the scarp and erodes some of that sand away. And then the top of the scarp can kind of slump off. And so this process of undercutting and slumping is a well-known, well-characterized process of scarp progression. But what we don't really know is how we go from a completely unscarped beach to something that is really highly erosive and progressively scarping. And so this work is mostly focused around understanding those mechanisms so we can model which types of beaches might be most vulnerable to scarping. Okay, so this is what the progression of the scarp looked like in the wave lab. We ran 47 trials and they were each 300 waves. I'll talk about those in a few minutes, but you can see from trial 38, and I'll talk about these in trials in the future slides. So from trial 38 to 46, you can see we go from a pretty smooth profile to something that has an instability and then progressively forms into the scarp that we see on the beach. And so this is what our hydrodynamic conditions looked like. They were scaled down from Hurricane Sandy. So our significant wave height went up to about 1 meter high waves. The peak periods were around 6 to 7 seconds. And the way we modeled surge was in between trials, we would stop the waves to do our measurements, and then we would increase the water in the flume itself and then run the next set of waves. So that was how we simulated surge happening. And the red area in the box is where the scarp began to form. So that will be where I focus most of the rest of the talk on. So our research questions were, what are the physical mechanisms of scarp formation and how can we parameterize these mechanisms in a model? Just to acquaint everyone with some of the processes I'll be talking about, this is a schematic of what the water table might look like inside of a beach. And so the black line is the dune, and then the orange dashed line is the position of the effective water table. And so right under where the waves are breaking, there's actually a bulge in the water table because there's so much infiltration at that point. And that bulge then decreases down to match what the water table is back in the dunes or the beach further on shore. So as the storm surge comes in, or storm surge plus tides or whatever, and the waves progressively move towards the shore or towards landward, this bulge in the water table will move with the waves. So that's this orange dashed line moving. And then as the waves are coming in, they're infiltrating down, the water is infiltrating down through the sediments. But when this bulge in the water table becomes too high, then you'll actually have some exfiltration of water up out of the sediments as the wave is going back to the ocean. So those are all processes that I'll be talking about a little bit more. So underneath this bulge in the water table, the sediments are mostly saturated. There might be some air bubbles in there still. And above the water table, they're mostly unsaturated or partially saturated. Okay, so one of the terms that I'll be talking about is matrix suction. And this is the force that holds partially saturated sands together due to capillarity and surface tension. So you have your sand grains, and this water in between them is actually holding them together. It's kind of like when you hold your finger on a straw and it holds the water inside of the straw. That's kind of happening in between all of the sand grains. And when you make a sand castle, those sediments are partially saturated and they'll stick together. But if you're sand becomes like super wet, then you will probably see that your sandcastle doesn't really stay up. So matrix section is what's holding your sandcastle up. So when the water content gets higher, then your sediment will start to move apart. It starts to flow past past each other. And this is kind of when a landslide is triggered. So when the matrix section gets too low, there's not enough suction, then you could trigger something like a landslide. The next term is partial momentary liquefaction. It does say that underneath the black bar. So the first term is liquefaction. And so liquefaction occurs when the effective stress in between the sand grains goes to 0. And this is often talked about in the context of earthquakes. So just as another sketch, you have saturated sediments in this case, and then you have some intense shaking, and the sediments then all are moving past each other like it's like quicksand, very fluid. And that is when you have liquefaction of sediment. So if you were in quicksand, you would just sink down. Or you see after an earthquake, if there's houses in an area with like on a river, old riverbed, then the houses often have sank down into those sediments. So that's liquefaction. And then the momentary word is that it's just happening for a second, not very much time at all. So this often occurs after a sudden decrease in pressure at the surface. And so if we have a wave going by, then it's loading the sediments. So putting a force onto the top of the sediments, the force increases, and then the wave passes by, and the force has, or the stress, I guess, has increased all the way down through that column of sediments. And then as the wave completely passes by, the sediment one is now unloaded. So you can have this pressure actually moving back up through the sediments. And so that's when you have these partial momentary liquefaction events. So your wave comes by, it loads the sediments, and then the wave, in this case on the beach, recedes, goes back to the ocean, and those sediments are unloaded, and the sediments, like for just a moment, just like burst apart from each other. They kind of pulse. And I'll be talking about this in terms of the pore water pressure gradient. So this is the gradient of the pore water pressure, which is the pressure in between the sand grains in the water, with respect to the vertical elevation in the sediments. Okay, so the critical threshold for liquefaction is approximately -1. So when this pressure gradient goes to -1, or it's like a normalized pressure gradient goes to -1. And anything below 0, though, we define as a partial momentary liquefaction event. So the sediments are unstable for that moment in time. Okay, and then the last concept is slope stability. So you can just think of this as a block on a slope, and because of gravity, the block will slide or could slide down the slope. And so there's some resisting force, like the sand grains or the friction of the sand grains in the case of a beach, holding the other sand grains above it up, like on the beach, making it so it's harder for them to slide down. But if that surface is destabilized by something like liquefaction, it's a lot easier for those sediments to be picked up and pulled offshore. Okay, so those are some of the terms. Now we'll get back to the experiment. This is a cross-section view of the dune. So it's like you took a slice out of the dune and you're looking inside. We instrumented the inside of the dune with moisture sensors to measure water content and the water table position, and pressure sensors to measure the water table position and pressure fluctuations. So anywhere you see a blue square, there's moisture sensors, as well as the brown circle. There's moisture sensors there as well. And then there's pressure sensors everywhere where there's a triangle or a brown circle. So we had 30 moisture sensors and 15 pressure sensors buried in the dune. And then we had a bunch more instruments than this, but the ones I'm focusing on are these and the lidar. So we had a lidar on a cart, and it was scanning not only the morphology of the dune, so how the dune shape changed, but also every single run-up event onto the dune. So we could monitor how the run-up and morphology interacted. So now this is the same, like you're looking at a cross-section of the dune, but the evolution of the profile in time. So the first trial pictured is trial 2. That's this purple, dark purple line. So the x-axis is cross-shore or position, where the wave maker would be at x equals 0. And the y-axis is elevation on the dune. So we see a berm and then a mildly sloping dune for trial 2. And then as we go from blue to green to yellow, we see the dune eroding and the scarp forming by the time we get to about trial 42. We have one of those scarps that is progressively eroding shoreward in time. So another way to look at that same plot is now every one of these cross sections of the dune is plotted in time. But instead of just showing the raw elevation, we are showing the slope of the dune. So the top plot is showing time or trial number on the x-axis and the cross-shore position from the wave maker on the y-axis. So on the y-axis, a cross-shore position of 0 is the position of the wave maker. And the color is the dune slope. So we can see that as we get to these more yellow colors, this is where the scarp is forming in time, and we can see it progressing landward. So landward would be towards the top of the plot. Now the bottom plot is showing the accretion and erosion pattern on this same profile. So again, we have trial number or time on the x-axis and position in the cross-shore direction on the y-axis. Let's start by just looking at the color, and I'll explain the lines in a second. So the color is showing you white is no change, blue is a position where there's been erosion, and red is a position where there's been accretion. So we can see where the scarp forms here. We have a lot of blue colored region on the erosion accretion plot. So that's showing you that there is a bunch of erosion where the scarp formed. That makes sense to us. Then we see, another thing we see is that there's this big red area of accretion at the top of the position where the scarp was forming. So you can see this line is kind of where the initial instability started and progressively formed into a scarp. This accretional area is really interesting. I'll explain why it forms in a second. So now let's look at the dashed lines. So the top dashed line is the position of the maximum run-up events. So this is where when you have a big swash event on the beach, the tippiest top of that swash event rushes the furthest up, and that's the position of the highest run-up. And then the red dashed line is the R2%. So this is saying that the highest 2% of run-up events reach to this lighter red dashed line. So now what we see is this red accretional area is happening right between that R2% and R max run-up lines. And that's showing us that the biggest waves that were running up on this beach, when they were turning around, they're running up and then rushing back down, they slow down in that instant and they drop a lot of suspended sediment that they were carrying onto the top of the profile. So we actually have wave-driven accretion happening here. So the beach is actually building up sediment in that position. Now, seaward of there, we see this line of erosion. And these are just our 10%, our 16%. Those are the highest 10% and 16% of run-up events. So we see this juxtaposition of wave-driven accretion and erosion where the scarp started to form. And that becomes really important. We'll come back to that at the end of the talk. And then the final line on here is the water table bulge. This is that bulge I showed on the schematic at the beginning where that bulge inside of the dune is of the water table. And so we tracked this the best that we could. And it's kind of following the position of the scarp location. Okay, so now if we just focus on these, there were 7 moisture sensors, 1 at each position, and 3 pressure sensors in these middle orange dots. We're going to focus on data from those for the rest of the talk. This plot is showing you the trial number or the trials in color. So blue is trial 34 and teal is trial 41. And the solid line is the line of where the dune profile was. And the dashed line is showing you the position of the pressure head or that water table bulge. So what I want to show from this plot, we were measuring the pressure and the water table bulge position using the pressure and the moisture sensors. So if we just look at trial 36, which is this lighter blue color line, we can see that during trial 36, the position of the dune profile was higher up than the water table bulge, the dashed line. But as we went further in time, so to trial 38, 40, and 41, we can see that this water table bulge becomes higher in elevation than the dune profile, the sand surface itself. So what this is saying is that the pressure was so high that during this time period, there was water exfiltrating up and out of the sediments almost continuously. That's going to be important later on. Okay, so now these are some time series from the data that the data from the pressure and moisture sensors that were buried in the dune. So I'll break this down. I know it's a lot on one slide. The top plot is showing you swash depth. So every single one of these is showing you sensor measurement change in time. So time is on the x-axis. The top plot is showing you the cross shore position. So again, the wave maker is at position 0. And then the orange dashed line here is showing you the location where these middle orange moisture and pressure sensors were buried. So we see this is showing the run-up position measured by the lidar in time. So every time the run-up goes above the position of those moisture sensors that were buried at meter 77, on the second plot down, we see the swash depth at that cross shore position. So we're seeing like a 20 centimeters of depth at maximum when this run-up event went shoreward of that meter mark. These plots over here are going to be cheat sheets. They're all the same from this last plot. So you can see the water table is below the sediment surface during trial 36. Then we'll look at the bottom plot first. So this again is time, and on the x-axis or the y-axis, we see the partial momentary liquefaction potential. So we're actually seeing the pressure gradient. So positive pressure gradients are indicating stability. So the water is infiltrating down through the sediments. Now, if we go to trial 38, we have the same plot on the top. We see the swash position, but now we see that we have some bigger run-up events on our dune. So at meter 77 is where these pressure sensors are buried again. If we look at the swash depth, we get to almost 40 centimeters of depth at that position. And then if we go to the bottom plot, we see the pressure gradients. So we're actually now seeing so we're looking at the difference in pressure between two vertically stacked pressure sensors. And now we're seeing there's a big stabilizing event followed by a destabilizing event, or a partial momentary liquefaction event. So the pressure gradient goes negative and we're seeing those sediments dilate, come apart from each other. And if we look at the moisture sensor data, this is going to be important later on because we only had this one stack of pressure sensors. We actually see the moisture sensor showing that the sediments are compressed. So it's squeezing moisture out of the sediments when the wave is loading the sediments. So the wave comes up, it's like putting so much pressure on the sediments that the moisture in the sediments is getting squeezed out. And then the wave recedes. So on the downrush, there's a big spike in the moisture content. So the sediments are dilating during that recession of the wave. And then if we go further, trial 40, now we see the water table bulges much above the sediments, and we're seeing many more occurrences of partial momentary liquefaction, which is indicated by the red dashed or red columns on the final plot. So in time, this is from trial 33 to trial 40. The top plot is showing you the slope of the dune that we looked at a few slides ago. The orange dashed line is showing the location of those moisture and pressure sensors, and the yellow, remember, is the position where the scarp was formed, indicated by a really steep slope. And then the second plot down is showing the partial momentary liquefaction events indicated by those red vertical lines. So we can see that as we get to trial 38, 39, 40, and then further on, we see many, many instances of partial momentary liquefaction occurring at that meter mark. Okay, so now we're going to look at why those partial momentary liquefaction events were occurring. So the sand surface elevation is the position where the surface of the sediments were, and the hydraulic pressure head is the position where the water table bulge is. So on the next slide, I'm going to show a plot of sand surface elevation minus the position of the water table bulge. If that number is positive, then we have the stabilizing condition. The water table bulge is below the surface of the sediments. And if that number is negative, that means that the water table bulge is above the sediments, and we have water seeping up and out of the sand surface continuously. Okay, so now if we go back to the time series I showed you, the bottom histograms here are showing the SSE minus HPH on the x-axis and occurrences of partial momentary liquefaction on the y-axis. So the black dashed line is showing when the water table bulge rises above the surface of the sediments. So when this number is negative, then the water table bulge is above the surface of the sediments. So we see that as the water table bulge goes above the surface of the sediments, we have many, many more occurrences of partial momentary liquefaction. And this is showing now that the partial momentary liquefaction events were occurring on the downrush of the swash bore. So the x-axis is showing the depth of the swash. The y-axis is showing the partial momentary liquefaction, and the color is showing the change in the swash depth in seconds. So a blue color is saying that the partial momentary liquefaction is occurring on a downrush event, and the red color is showing on an uprush event. And so remember, negative numbers are partial momentary liquefaction occurring, and positive numbers are stability for the pore water pressure gradient. So we see most of our liquefaction events are occurring when that swash event rushed up the beach, and then the sediments were unloaded, and it was rushing down, and that's when the liquefaction occurred. So we saw, the plots I just showed you were time series from this stack of moisture and pressure sensors at meter 77. But what we really need to show is that those partial momentary liquefaction events progressed shoreward in time. So this plot is showing data from the moisture sensors. And remember, I showed that the volumetric water content, or the amount of moisture in the sediments, kind of decreased during the uprush event and then increased a lot during the downrush, during the liquefaction event. And so what this is showing is that from moisture sensor 30, which was seaward of the meter 77, to moisture sensor 15, which was at meter 77, to moisture sensor 28, which was at meter 78, we actually see the average difference between this stabilizing to this destabilizing volumetric water content increase in time. So we're actually seeing evidence that the partial momentary, that this meter 76 was seeing partial momentary liquefaction about 3 or 4 trials before meter 77 was, which was about 3 or 4 trials before meter 78 was. So we can see that those liquefaction events were progressing in time. So some of the conclusions are, we observed the formation of a scarp, and the scarp was actually formed because of the juxtaposition of the wave-driven accretion, which is this red area here we talked about at the beginning from the highest run-up events, and this momentary liquefaction that was occurring right next to those wave-driven accretion events. And so the dune was accreting and eroding right next to each other, causing a slope instability. So something that became a little bit steep, just a little bit steep. But as that continued, as the liquefaction and the wave-driven accretion events continued, it became more and more steep, creating this location where scarping was much more likely to occur. So we believe that those two processes are really important for the formation of a beach or a dune scarp, and that knowing how to predict those with considering the water table bulge position, the slope of your beach, where you might have wave-driven accretion, would all be important for predicting vulnerability of a beach or a dune to catastrophic erosion. This is one way that we're thinking about modeling this. This is called the Shields parameter. It's a metric used to understand what sediments are vulnerable to eroding. And basically the takeaway is this black line here is showing the standard Shields parameter, and the colored lines are showing variations on the Shields parameter. So if we modify the Shields parameter to include pressure gradients and beach slope, which it currently doesn't have, then we see that the vulnerability of sediments to eroding, these red lines here, increases by about 4 or 5 times. So it's a pretty big difference. And this could be important for process-based numerical models to consider in the future. And then I just wanted to show the difference between the bare and the vegetated dune. I have some colleagues working more on the vegetated dune piece. But we had a really surprising finding that the vegetated dune scarped earlier in time than the bare dune. We thought it would go the other way. And I think this is for 2 reasons. One is that the plants on the dune, the vegetation grew in place for 6 months, but in ecology standards, that's not really very long. So you could consider this to be more like a a man-made dune. We restore dunes all over the country with newly planted grasses. And so this could be like one that was in place for 6 months before it was hit with hurricane waves. But more importantly than that, what we think happened, so if you look at the two plots at the top, we see the bare dune on the left, and the orange line here you can see is not scarped yet, but the orange line over here is already formed a scarp. So the scarp progresses much more quickly on the vegetated dune in time. We think what happened is all these jaggedy lines are positions of vegetation that were measured by the lidar, that there was like micro scale erosion, like scour around the stems of the vegetation, causing instabilities at the location of the stems, making the dune more vulnerable to scarping earlier because it had a different mechanism causing that instability. So my hypothesis is that this happens on like established dunes as well, with vegetation that's been there for many years. But the root network or like the rhizome network inside of the dune is likely much more dense. And so even if that dune started to scarp earlier, it might be able to hold the sediment in place because of those rhizomes that are buried in the dune. So just maybe we need to do more experiments on dunes that have been there a long time. So with that, these are all of the students and faculty and helpers for this work. It was really a big effort, big team. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. So happy to take any questions.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, thank you for such an interesting talk. I was just wondering about during the setup of the experiment, if there was a way to predict how many trials in any sort of scarping event would take place, or if you guys just had to run it and see how many trials you'd actually need to observe something like this.
Yeah, good question. No, we did not know how many trials it would take before scarping happened. Yeah, because the reason why we're doing the project was to try to figure out where scarps form, why they form. So the model, like the current models, just kind of predict that if your beach is steep enough, it will form a scarp. And so it's a really coarse prediction of scarp formation. So yeah, we didn't know. And actually during the vegetated dune experiment, that was the one we did first because we had to grow the plants in place. We saw like where the scarp formed. And so during the bare dune experiment, we moved a bunch of our sensors to be closer to that location so that we could actually monitor what was happening internally. Yeah, so it's kind of like science on the fly, I guess.
Question online?
Oh, thank you. Very, very interesting. So first is a sort of maybe a hard philosophical question, but from what you learned, how would you apply those findings to those people that are challenged by having real estate above a dune that is at threat for loss?
It's a good question. I think what we could first do is a lot of the managers have a hard time predicting which beaches are most vulnerable to scarping and erosion. So the findings would first go to improving the models that are used to inform managers about scarping and erosion. If you have a house that's on the beach. Well, we did also do the biocemented dune to investigate if there was mitigation, a strategy for mitigating erosion that didn't involve putting rocks on the beach or concrete. And that biocementation could, in conjunction with plants, make the dune much more robust in areas that are really vulnerable to erosion, and protect a community for a little bit longer. Another thing that's been investigated is putting a seawall inside of a dune, and that's shown that that seawall inside of the dune is more resilient to erosion than a seawall by itself or a dune by itself. So that's another option that some of the communities on the East Coast are using. But yeah, the results from this, I think, are a little bit more, would be more geared towards managers than helping someone who was already having an erosion problem. It's a good question.
I just wanted to know if there's a rate at which the United States beaches are eroding that you could tell us about. I don't really know anything about that.
Sorry, what was the beginning?
Yeah, just a rate at which, I mean, are we
Oh, a rate.
losing, some percentage of beaches every year? I just don't know what those figures, I can't fathom what they would be.
Yeah, sure. So this isn't the best, the most descriptive answer to your question, but there are, like, the USGS has done some studies looking at erosion rates. But this plot, the beginning shows a bit which coastlines are the most vulnerable to eroding. So the Gulf and the East Coast are definitely most vulnerable. Some beaches are eroding, a meter a year. Some are 10 meters a year. It really depends on where you are. Those numbers can also shift with ocean oscillations. So in Oregon, like Peter Ruggiero has shown that there's like a 20-year cycle in beaches that are eroding and accreting. In Oregon, we're a little different. We do have a lot of beaches that are accreting in time, like they're building a meter out in time. We have a lot of sand, but that could shift in the future to erosion problems. So it's a hard question because it's very variable, but I would say like 1 to tens of meters a year at most.
Follow on from your answer to my earlier question, this cementizing of dunes using bacteria seems very cool and an obvious solution, but obviously there must be some issues as it's not happening all over the place. Could you talk about that a bit? Or it seemed like that was part of your experiment, but you didn't report on it today, or?
Oh, I didn't present the results today. So we did do a part of the experiment looking at the biocemented dune and its resilience, I guess, to erosion with 2 different types of treatments where you would inject the biocementation or you spray it on the surface. I would say the biggest barriers to using something like that is permitting, because it could disturb habitat. Like, there are species that really depend on sand movement. And so if you're stabilizing the sediment, then you wouldn't have that movement of sand anymore. And also they're still working on, so that work was done with some geotechnical engineers, one here at OSU, Matt Evans. They're still working on trying to understand how you can use biocementation in conjunction with vegetation. If you inject the biocementation on the vegetation, there has been some issues with vegetation survival. So I think that's still all kind of like an active area of research. But I think in areas like, for instance, on the Outer Banks in North Carolina, there's some stretches going down to Cape Hatteras where there's just tractors that are sitting, backhoes that sit on the side of the road because they're just continuously like pushing sediment that's blown all over the road back onto one of the sides of the road. So there, the dune is so disturbed anyway by these people moving sand around that if you did decide to do some biocementation there to stabilize the sediment so it didn't blow into the road, that could be something beneficial that wouldn't necessarily harm a habitat. But I think that's all still kind of being investigated.
Any questions from the room?
Grain size, how, what does it do? Going bigger, going smaller, what does it change?
So yeah, grain size definitely changes infiltration rates. So if you had finer sediment, you'd be more vulnerable to liquefaction. So likely those beaches have more scarps. A coarser grain size allows infiltration, a lot more rapid infiltration. And so you're probably not as vulnerable to scarping because you don't have any of that liquefaction or much of it happening. So grain size definitely does play a big role in stability.
Could we then use that as mitigation when you started to see the formation of the scarp?
Like putting coarser grain on the beach. Well, that's getting into dynamic revetments. Dynamic revetments are another coastal engineering with nature strategy that could be functional in Oregon because we already have a lot of mixed grain beaches. Dynamic revetments are using cobble or coarser sediments to basically armor a beach, but the sediments are still small enough that they can roll around in the surf. So they kind of buffer the sand from erosion. And there's different communities in Oregon that are trying to use dynamic revetments for erosion mitigation. So you could, but I don't know if I would do that if the beach didn't already have some sort of cobble on it. Doesn't seem like a good idea, but I don't know if people have looked at that. Yeah.
I had a couple questions. All right, I had a question. Great presentation, fascinating. The level of resolution in determining that point, that threshold where it changes is amazing. Really appreciate that. And the comment related to the dynamic revetment, which we have several along the Marine Science Center, of course. So at what point my question is, at what point does that turn into a landslide?
That's a good question. Well, a landslide would have to, yeah, I guess if you were scarping a hill or in Oregon, we have some places where there's big morphological features next to the coast and they are kind of scarped out of the bottom. So there's I'm going to say this wrong, but I think it's Moore's circle. Yeah, that's right. Moore's circle is a geotechnical term, and anything in this circle from the lowest plane up, if it becomes wet enough, could slide down and slump off. So I would say it would become a landslide if you weren't just a dune, but it was a really big dune or a big hill or moving towards a cliff. Yeah.
Most of the Oregon coast.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in following up to that, that threshold or that point that you're talking about, that the highest point, I guess, of landslide, obviously a big concern for our coastal community. I'm curious to know if there's new projects that you're doing related to that up and down our coast.
Yeah, I don't have any projects related to landslides. There are some people in engineering that do, like Mike Olson and Ben Lipchinsky. They have landslide projects and they're looking at the stability of those, like the massive landslides. They go out and they scan them with a lidar and like look at how much they've moved over a couple months or before and after big rainstorms. They would be an interesting people to give a seminar to. I have a project looking at dynamic revetments though, or cobble beaches and run up on cobble beaches. Not quite the same as a landslide, but.
One more final question. When you're the data that you're showing up there, that you did show up there, where you saw those changes over the year or over the time, how did you coincide and look at how that was related to king tides?
Oh yeah, so this was done in the lab, so we didn't look at anything to do with the king tides here, but there are people that have looked at on the east and west coast, like the vulnerability of impact to the dunes during king tides, and it does increase quite a bit, especially in like lower lying areas. Yeah.
And then the map where you show the entire country,
Yeah.
would you mind pulling that map up again?
I think it's this one.
Oh, sorry. On that map, what was my question? I forgot it. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Fascinating talk. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Yeah.
All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And a recorded version of this will be up online in a couple days. We wish you happy holidays and take care. Thank you.